imagined a whole village. Do you know that feeling you get when you see something that others don't? And you have a hard time convincing them that it was real. Usually you find yourself dealing with one or two of your overly paranormal believing friends against the word of your logical friends. I was born and raised in the Middle East. We don't believe in ghosts, but we do believe in demons, which we call jinns. But not in a paranormal way, but rather in a religious way. Growing up, my mother taught me our cultural and religious traditions concerning these kinds of things. You know, the things that everyone takes part in, like saying the name of God in your prayers, when you're afraid of the dark, and so on. You should also know that believing in ghosts is very taboo where I come from. So, growing up, I never believed in the paranormal. I was taught that it wasn't right, and it was not encouraged. So like I said, the setting for this story takes place in the Middle East. I'm a 19-year-old female, and one day, 12 of my friends from high school and I decided to go on a road trip to go camping. We were still trying to decide where exactly we wanted to camp when my mother dropped us off at a petrol station where I was meeting all of my friends in a parking lot. Now, another thing you should know is that where I live is very spread out, and driving across our states could take anywhere between 1 to 4 hours, depending on which state you're driving through. Eventually, we all decided to take 2 cars, one for most of us, and the other for most of our supplies. Before we left, we bought some snacks, drinks, some ice for the cooler, and filled our cars with gas before we got on the road. Up until this point, we hadn't yet decided on a camping ground. So finally, one of my friends, a 20-year-old male, had an idea to go to this camping ground he knew, one he had been to with his family before. Now you should know that where we live is a very safe place. It's about 90% desert and mountains, so there aren't many creepy woods or much of anything that anyone could hide behind. So everyone felt safe taking this trip. There are many campsites in my country, so it's very common to come across people doing exactly what we decided to do. Just start driving in one direction until you feel you found the right spot. And since the group of us weren't really planners, and the place he suggested was the closest place, we all agreed and decided to head there. We waved goodbye to our respective parents and decided to head off. We had been driving for about 2 hours when we approached a place called Al-Masafi. We saw a small restaurant, so we decided to stop for a quick meal and stretch our legs. We got back on the road within an hour and came next to a place called Yuma Bazaar, or the Friday markets. Now, keep the next part of the story in mind for later. The conversation I'm about to tell you was really strange, to say the least. Now, if you were to hear this story from a particular friend of mine who was there and overheard it, she would tell you that I was reading too much into it, but here goes. While walking through the bazaar, I started speaking to one of the locals. He had a wide variety of fruits he was selling, and I couldn't help but noticing a bag of lychees that looked rotten. He noticed me looking at them and asked what was wrong. I should mention at this point that he spoke to me in Arabic, which I could tell from his accent wasn't his first language, but I understood what he was saying. I pointed to the bag and asked if people would buy expired fruit. I wasn't trying to be mean, but I was curious. I said it nicely, so I figured he wouldn't get mad, and I was right. Instead of getting mad, he just smiled and laughed. He reached to pick up the bag and said, "It's okay if I don't sell them. If I don't sell them, I'll just drive up there, and when I return, they'll be fresh again." As he said this, he pointed towards a dirt path just off the road that was clearly being used due to the fresh tire tracks. I genuinely laughed as I looked back towards the man, because what he was saying didn't make sense. But I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, and just figured he meant to say something else. Like I said before, it was clear that Arabic wasn't his first language, so I just thought that something got lost in translation. Perhaps he meant that he would go down the road to a grocery store or farm and buy a fresh bag. Then again, the phrase he used was correct. At this point, it was about 3 p.m., and the girl next to me, who heard this whole conversation, decided to pull me towards the car so we could get back on the road. It was getting late and hot, and we needed to keep driving if we wanted to reach our camp. We still needed to set our tents up before nightfall. So we all got back in our cars, and my friend put the campsite address into Google Maps, and we drove off. I should mention that none of my other friends, besides the boy who had been there with his family, had ever camped at this particular place before. Besides him, none of the rest of us had ever driven out this way, so we were surprised when we came up on a little village. None of the other villages or towns we'd passed up until this point was like this one. It was incredible. There were people everywhere, standing around in groups, dressed in bright colors, sitting on the porches while children played all around. There were even animals everywhere. I remember seeing a large group of goats, and even a donkey with her young. Everyone looked happy as they waved at us as we drove past. It's not uncommon to have people from out-of-the-way villages wave at passing cars, so none of us were surprised. Up until this point, there wasn't anything unusual about what was happening. But then, things started to change. The people went from waving to us, to waving at us, and gesturing for us to stop. My friend noticed this, and told the boy driving not to stop. She said they might seem friendly at first, but that once you get out of your car, they'll try to force you to buy stuff from them. He agreed and kept driving. He turned his head towards the back seat and asked if one of us could look up the name of this village online, because he didn't remember going through this place with his family. That's when all of a sudden a man came out, seemingly out of nowhere, and was just standing right in the middle of the road, with a tray in his hand. Luckily, the boy stopped driving the car in time. If we would have been going any faster, I'm sure we would have hit him. Everyone freaked out about the accident we had just avoided when we noticed he was shouting at us. He was asking us to get out of our car because he wanted to give us some pomegranate. The man stepped around to the driver's side window and lowered the tray, and all of us were stunned. He wasn't mad about almost being hit by the car. He really wanted to show us this pomegranate. The pomegranate he had on the tray was the most colorful and delicious-looking, juicy pomegranate any of us had ever seen. I remember thinking in that moment that it was really strange for this man to have a pomegranate that looked that fresh, way out here in this village. Pomegranates do not grow all the way out here, and there are no supermarkets in this area. The nearest one was an hour back in the direction we came, so it didn't make sense that he would have one this fresh. It honestly looked like it was just picked off the tree. Anyone who has picked a fresh pomegranate would know what I'm talking about. They look very different from the ones you buy at the store. At this point, the man started to become more agitated and asked more and more of us to get out of the car. That's when we noticed more villagers starting to come closer. We all started getting really freaked out because these formerly friendly-looking villagers suddenly seemed very menacing. Their demeanor switched from pleasant to frantic, and it gave all of us a sense that we needed to get out of there right away. My friend that was driving stepped on the gas and managed to get us back on the road before we got surrounded. We were driving at highway speed within seconds. As we made our hasty exit, we looked back at the villagers all standing in the middle of the road, just glaring at us. And it gave me a very creepy setting everything up, and were completely done before nightfall. It was just about dusk when we sat around our campfire, started preparing our food. We opened some drinks and started roasting some marinated chicken over the fire. Nothing about our campsite was scary. Everything in our front view was just desert, and behind our camp were a few small mountains we had a very clear view of. Even at dusk, the view was extremely clear. The scariest thing you'd encounter here, maybe, is a goat chewing on your tent. Snakes, scorpions, and smaller desert foxes are possible, but highly unlikely near a campfire. We weren't the only campers there either. There was a family with 2 kids camping a few dunes over. We spent a long time by the fire talking, eating, and drinking, just having a good time. We all went to bed around 2 a.m., and by that time it was pitch black, and I was freezing beyond belief as I went into my tent that I was sharing with 2 of my friends. I'm not sure how long it took me to fall asleep, but I do know that for some reason I woke up rather suddenly at 4:10 a.m. The entire campsite was dead silent, and I'm not sure what it was that woke me up. Then I noticed that I could hear the faint voices of the family camping near us. I began to hear the sounds of them packing up and getting ready to leave. I thought it was strange that they were leaving at such an early hour, but then I realized it's actually pretty common for people to leave their campsites early, or not even stay the whole night. We didn't know when they arrived, so it's possible they arrived earlier than us, and never actually planned on sleeping all the way through the night. If that was their plan, perhaps they actually stayed longer than they had intended and needed to leave. But something about their voices started to unsettle me. Maybe it was the fact that their voices sounded stressed. I heard short bursts of speech, sort of like whisper yelling, if that makes sense. I heard hurried knocks and bangs, and the sound of doors being opened and closed quickly. I noticed also that they weren't speaking English. I couldn't make it out, but it kind of sounded like German or something similar. I tried to lay back down, but couldn't fall back to sleep. 20 minutes later, I heard the sound of their car starting and them driving off. I did manage to pass out for about an hour and a half and was woken up again at 5 a.m. along with my tent mates. By this point, it was starting to be a little brighter outside, so we decided to exit our tent before the boys woke up so we could go relieve ourselves without them seeing. It is the desert after all, so there aren't many places for privacy. At this point, I remember holding up a blanket around my friend while she took care of business, as I glanced over to the horizon towards the mountain range. All of a sudden, what looked like a woman dressed in traditional clothing, with her face mostly covered, started staring at us from the top of the mountain. It wasn't a very large mountain, so she was pretty clear, and we could definitely tell she was looking straight at us. None of us knew why this woman was doing this. Maybe she was curious. Maybe she was a villager. It's possible there was another village on the other side of that mountain. My friend tried to break the uneasy feeling by waving at her, but she didn't wave back. She just stood there. Then she did the creepiest thing. She just started walking backwards towards, I guess, where she had came from, until she was out of sight. I didn't like that at all and got goosebumps. I looked quickly back towards the other dune where the other family had been and saw that they'd definitely gone. But when I turned back to look towards the mountain again, the woman was back, but now it looked like she was just sitting, and all we could see was the top of her head peeking over the top of the hill. Was she waiting for us to leave? My friends and I got really creeped out and headed back into our camp just in time for the rest of the crew to have woken up. We all got the camp backed up and hopped in the car and started heading back the way we came. The rest of the day was normal until we reached the last village we'd passed through yesterday. Yesterday, the village was teeming with people, but now it was empty. Sure, It was the early morning, and perhaps everyone was still sleeping, but it wasn't just that the village looked empty. It looked totally different. The freakiest thing was how wrecked the village looked now. It didn't look lived in like yesterday. This looked like it hadn't been lived in or even taken care of in years. Everything was falling apart. Now there were bricks strewn across the road, making our car shake as we passed through. We all started to get very uneasy. It looked like a bomb went off, but there were no bodies. No people at all. It looked very clearly abandoned. Nearly every building looked like it had chunks missing from them, like they'd all been decaying for years. But this didn't make any sense. This didn't happen in one night. How could it? So what happened? We passed through this exact same place just yesterday, and it didn't look like this. One of my friends said, "Where are we?" My other friend opened up her phone and started Googling. Finally, she said, Al Jazirat al-Hamra. It's a ghost town. After a few moments of stunned silence, my friend started freaking out, because apparently it shouldn't be possible for us to even be here. We were only 2 hours away from our home city, but this place is 4 hours away. How on earth did we get here? We hadn't driven long enough to make it here. It just didn't make sense. We all started freaking out and started to yell at my friend driving to just get us out of here. As we drove, I didn't want to look back, but I needed to make sure the other car was following us. I clenched my fists and turned around to see that they were. But my relief on seeing that our friends were behind us didn't last long, because almost immediately I noticed something terrifying. I let out a small scream that made my friends nearly stop the car. What is it?" he said. I pointed at that woman my 2 other friends and I saw staring at us from the mountain. She was standing on the other side of the road in between us and our friends, in the car behind us. One of my friends started screaming, "There she is, there she is." And then she started running straight for us. She looked crazed, like she wanted to harm us. "Drive, drive," I cried. My friend slammed on the gas pedal and the car peeled out, sending a cloud of dust in the woman's direction. The dust was so thick I couldn't see her at all. I tried to calm myself down, but couldn't look away from that cloud of dirt and dust in the air. I thought for a moment that she disappeared, but just before the village passed below the horizon again, I saw her, just standing there motionless, staring in our direction. I held my breath until she was finally out of sight. This was the most terrifying experience I ever had. We tried to figure out what had happened on the drive home, but none of us could explain it. The other really terrifying thing was, we made it home in the proper amount of time. It didn't make any sense at all. Did we imagine this village? Or did we slip into some alternate reality or warp space and time? That sounds really far out there, I know. And I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying I really don't know. The fact is, we can't explain it. I couldn't sleep for a week after this experience. My parents even asked a local imam to come and pray with me. Eventually, I moved away to another country, and things have been calm, and I haven't experienced anything like this again. But I think of it a lot. None of my friends who were on this trip with me like to talk about it, though. My one friend keeps bringing up one thing, though. Remember I told you about the man who said he just went to an area to get fresh lychees? Well, I thought about it again. I thought he meant to say he can get fresh ones by going somewhere. But after emptying the cooler, when we finally got home, I decided he meant what he told me literally. When we got home that day, we emptied our cooler and expected that we would need to dump out water from the melted ice. But after more than 24 hours, when we opened up the cooler, it wasn't water. It was still full of perfect-looking ice cubes. After seeing that, I think what the man said was literal. He didn't go to that area to just get new lychees. He would go, pass through that village to make the lychees he had ripe again. I know it sounds completely crazy, but when you put everything together, that's the only thing that makes sense. Somehow, going through that area, however you get there, has some really weird effects on you. I personally think that guy should be very careful. One day, he may not be able to come back. That woman running towards us as we left certainly looked like she wanted to keep us there. So if you ever come across a place like this, get out as soon as you can. Or you might never be able to leave. This is a true story, despite how unbelievable it sounds. Most people that hear stories about some kind of weird animal creature just brush it off. But most people don't have the kind of personal experiences I do. The first time I saw it, I was around 9 or 10. I was living in Louisiana, near Honey Island Swamp, in St. Tammany Parish. I was out near the edges of the swamp with my friends, and there it was in the distance. It wasn't too tall, but it seemed very large to me. But again, I was only 9 or 10, so it's hard for me to judge. At first, we didn't know what we were looking at. I think we were looking at a side view of the curve of its hairy back about 200 feet away. It was peeking out from behind a tree. There were 3 of us, and as I recall, we all pretty much noticed it at the same time. We definitely noticed the hair, and one of my friends started to say something like, "Hey, does that look like a coat over there?" And the moment he finished speaking, a head snapped out from behind the tree and glared at us all with beady eyes and a fanged tooth grin. We all lost it and tore us back the way we came, not bothering to look back. We mentioned it to our respective families, but nobody believed us, of course, except one of the old-timers in town. We all stayed a long way away from that swamp for a long time after that. In 1998, I moved to Florida with my family, and about 2 days before my 19th birthday, I went camping with a few of my buddies. And that's when I saw that creature again. It was about dusk, and we all started smelling this rancid stench in the air. Now, I don't recall a smell from my encounter when I was a kid, but I must have picked up on something unconsciously because at the moment it hit my nostrils, the image of that fanged tooth grin and those beady eyes flashed in my mind. I started looking around for my rifle and scanning the edges of our camp. And after a few moments, I saw it. There it was, that same face just staring, barely lit by the glow of the fire. I shot towards it and made the guy closest to me nearly grab his pants. We all searched around a bit, but we didn't find anything. I've avoided camping ever since. Before I left the area to move back to Louisiana last year, I have caught a few glimpses of it in the woods while driving through the backwoods, usually at dusk. I think the reason I've seen it several times after the second encounter in '98 was because of the research I did after that night. I started asking around and doing a lot of research online to try and figure out what the hell that thing is. I learned that the area in Florida where my whole family moved had had a sighting of a monkey-like creature for years. If you've done any kind of similar searches, you'll know of a creature called the swamp ape. Now, I'm not sure why I had a thought to research my hometown in Louisiana before deciding to move back. But what I found were stories of a similar creature to the one I found in Florida. As it turns out, the creature in Louisiana is known by several different names, such as the Rougarou and the Louisiana Wookiee. It's also known as the Bayou Bonobo. A rather funny name, but what else are they going to call it? Now, remember that old-timer I told you about before? Well, 1 week after moving back, I actually came across him in town. I was surprised he was still kicking, but there he was. But even more surprisingly, he recognized me. We got to talking, and this creature came up. It was then that he called it the name that had escaped me all these years. That Bayou Bonobo. I chuckled a little when he said it, and he gave me a really sour look. He said something like, "Listen, son, that dang thing caused a lot of trouble in these parts." And then he told me the story my parents refused to tell me as a kid. He said the first sighting happened in 1988, at the very diner we were standing right in front of at that moment. He said it was around 8 p.m. on a really foggy night in early May. The manager was getting ready to close up when he heard banging at the front window. Thinking it was a patron trying to come in after closing, the manager turned around and prepared to turn them away. When he looked out and saw a gorilla-like creature just looking at him with beady eyes and sharp teeth, banging both fists on the front window, he called the police and said it was still there when they arrived. He said they had to fire off several rifle round shots in the air to scare it off. He said it ran off into the woods behind the diner and wasn't seen again until 1998. Which turned out only to be about a month before my family and I moved away. He said the encounter happened sometime in mid-December, and the police had been called around 7:30 at night. This time, because it was attacking people in their cars on the road. All of a sudden, he stopped talking and reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card and handed it to me. I looked down and saw that it was a business card with the name of Roland Franks, sheriff, written with gold leaf. I remember he grabbed my wrist as I tried to take the card from his hand. He looked at me with a glare in his eye and told me this was his grandson, and that he was there that day. He told me I should give him a call or pay him a visit. And he told me to tell him that his grandpa Remy asked me to contact him. And he told me that he doesn't like to talk about it, but that he would if I told him that his grandpa Remy asked him to. So there I was with this card in my hand. I looked back at the old-timer and said, "Sure, I'll pay him a visit. Thank you." About a week later, I actually ran into the sheriff by accident. I remember getting his card and thought, why not? I walked up to him, and after getting the pleasantries out of the way, I brought the subject up, and his demeanor changed. Fortunately, I remembered to tell him that his grandpa Remy asked me to talk to him. After I said that, he paused, and then gestured for me to come join him in the diner. We sat down and ordered some coffee, and then he got really quiet and told me the story. He started off by saying that nobody even likes to acknowledge that this event even happened. Everyone pretends that it didn't. But then I told him about my experience around 10 years old, and he seemed to loosen up a bit. He said it was a night in December 1998, and it was the most terrifying and mystifying tragedies of his life. He said that on that night, he was the only deputy on duty. He said it was a quiet night, and he wasn't expecting any trouble. But then the strangest call he ever got came through at 7:30 at night. He said the call came from this very diner, from a woman who sounded frantic. When he said this, I remember him pointing to a red phone sitting on the wall right across from where we were sitting. He said the woman was so terrified that he could barely understand her, but that he did manage to hear her describe some kind of ape creature. And then he remembered hearing some of the stories from the other deputies over the years about what happened in 1984. He said when he got the call, he was only about a mile away. And what he saw when he arrived chilled him to the bone. He saw a mangled mess of a body just lying in the middle of the road with blood everywhere. Initially, he thought some kind of accident must have happened. There was glass and dented metal everywhere. But there was only one car, yet it was completely smashed. He said there was a woman still in the car, cowering in the back seat with her 2-year-old daughter. Before he continued, he got even quieter. And in almost a whisper, he said he never saw fear in anybody's eyes like he saw in that woman and that little girl. The body in the middle of the road turned out to be their older brother. He was was driving his two sisters to the diner after a church event. Then he said he tried to get the two girls out of the back seat, but the door wouldn't open. Everything was smashed and they were too scared to try and climb out the window. And that's when he looked up and saw the creature, staring at him from behind the diner, with beady eyes and a fanged tooth grin. He noted that the creature looked almost like it was smiling at him with those crooked fangs. And then it just turned around and ran into the woods. After he said that, my heart fell into my stomach, because it sounded almost exactly the same as what I saw when I was a kid, right down to the toothy grin. I remember getting chills all over my body. Just after that, the sheriff got a call on his radio and got up to leave. But before he left, he stopped, looked down at me and said, "We ain't seen it since then, and we hope it stays that way." Then he paused one more time. He leaned down close to my ear and asked me not to ask anyone around town about what happened. He said people around here don't like to open old wounds. I nodded and said I wouldn't, and thanked him for talking with me. Then he turned around and left. This conversation happened about 3 weeks ago. I fully intended to just let this subject alone, and I figured I'd just avoid the swamps and woods, like I'd been doing these past years. I figured I'd just try to put it out of my mind and maybe I wouldn't see it again. But last night I was talking about it with my dad over the phone, and the subject came up again, so I decided to ask him about it. He never gave me any details, but that's exactly what I wanted for some reason. My father was evasive as always, but then I told him that I spoke with the sheriff. And then my father went quiet for a moment. When my father finally spoke again, his words chilled me to the bone. I will never forget them. He said he would never forget the look on poor Roland's face after losing his little brother that day. Beyond the veil. This happened to me 10 years ago now. It was on a normal night like any other. It was in the early evening after a typical school day. And since it was a regular school night, my brother and I were just chilling in my room after dinner. My family was in the living room watching a movie. I don't remember which one, but I remember it wasn't one I wanted to watch anyway, so there I was with my brother, hanging out in my room. But I remember for some reason I just wanted to be alone. It's not that I was annoyed by my brother being there, I just remember starting to feel really tired. I just wanted to get away from everything and everyone. Thinking back, maybe that's why my brother and I started the conversation we were having in the first place. I don't know, but we started talking about how sometimes you can just start letting yourself and your thoughts go, and your body just sort of goes into autopilot. My brother likes those kinds of metaphysical subjects, even though he doesn't really listen to what I'm saying. It's better than arguing with him about stupid shit. So like I was saying, we started talking about how your brain can send your thoughts into really deep places. And if you get caught up in it, your body just goes on autopilot. And how sometimes you can snap out of it, and it feels like a really long time has passed. And you can't remember what you were doing. I've heard people talk about going into a zone when they're on long drives and stuff. And something similar happens, and they can't remember most of the drive. I think some people call that losing time. I did some reading a while back on the same subject, nothing too deep. But I remember it's similar to some sort of dissociative state. I also remember reading that most people don't remember what they were doing when they lose time. Some people say they've been abducted by aliens and shit when they lose time. But I don't know anything about that, really. Were they really abducted? Who knows? I guess that really doesn't have much to do with my experience. But that's what my brother and I were talking about. So I was telling my brother how it can feel sometimes like you're in a dream, and it feels like nothing matters. You're just disconnected. It's kind of like you're watching what's going on around you as if you're inside one of those dreams where you know you're dreaming, even though you can't control the dream yet. I think that's called a vivid dream. So, we were just talking about this, and I remember I was describing one of my experiences to him, and how that for me, sometimes that feeling lasts for days. And then, all of a sudden, I got really thirsty. I didn't realize it at the time, but thinking back on this experience, I think at this point my brother's voice started to sound muffled, but I wasn't focusing on it. But his voice, along with all the other sounds that were rather loud, started to fade from my conscious awareness. Like I said, I've had these kind of experiences before, so I've learned not to let myself get too freaked out. When it happens, I usually just go with it, and everything's fine. But at this point, the experience became very different than anything else I'd ever experienced before. I remember getting up to head towards the kitchen to get a glass of water, because in the few seconds it took me to get up from where I was sitting, my mouth became like a desert. I never felt so thirsty before in my life. As soon as I got to my feet, I almost sprinted to the door of my room. And when I finally got into the hallway, my tongue felt like sandpaper. It was as if every second of time was stretched out into a million years, and also a fraction of a second at the same time. I didn't understand how I could feel time in both ways at once. It didn't make sense. It was at this point that I must have just gone into survival mode, because all I could think about was getting water. It felt like an eternity getting into the kitchen, which in reality is only like 10 steps from my room. The hallway, which is usually flooded with a retina-burning white light from light bulbs that I really think should be used for an outdoor porch. My dad was never really good at choosing the right appliances for our house, but I digress. The hallway was almost completely dark, but how could that be? Everyone was supposed to be in the living room watching a movie. How could this hallway suddenly be turned into a shadowy tunnel that seemingly had no end in sight? Well, as chilling as this realization was, my thirst wouldn't let me deal with it rationally. I just kept going down the endless stretch of shadow until somehow I finally reached the end and was gazing into what I thought was my living room. Just a few minutes before, my living room was filled with my family, my parents, my little sister, and my little cousin. Both of them are constantly screaming back and forth that echo through the whole house. But at this moment, the room I was looking into was completely empty. It looked like the mouth of a cave, and in that cave was an immense cavern that threatened to devour me whole. The feeling was that of looking into an immense void that somehow desired to swallow my entire consciousness. And I was frozen with fear. Every cell in my body pulled me away from this blackness, and my panic turned me on my heels towards the kitchen. Somehow, I made it, and I found myself standing in front of what looked like my kitchen. I even recognized my mom's magnetic poetry haphazardly strewn across the freezer door. But something was off. But what? I couldn't put my finger on it right away. But as I looked around, it hit me. Everything was gray. A dingy, washed-out gray like reading an old newspaper. And like the living room, this room also felt different. The living room felt like an active, living malice personified. But here, in the kitchen, it just felt cold and empty. But as confusing as this was, my thirst forced me to open the fridge and grab the water pitcher, which was exactly where I expected it to be. I quickly grabbed the glass out of the drying rack between the sink and the fridge and poured the water to the very top, spilling some on the counter and the floor as I brought it up to my lips. The water saturated my very soul. It was cold and exhilarating. It felt like I was being brought back to life. I don't know how many times I refilled that glass, but eventually, I felt like I could stop. When I turned around, ready to turn my attention to figuring out how I was going to get past that black void, and then everything changed. What the hell was going on? The quality of the rooms changed to a feeling you get when you're in an elevator and you're not ready for it to move, and your stomach drops a little. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Well, that's the feeling I got. But to my utter relief, the void was gone. I stepped towards the intersection between the kitchen and living room, with my back facing the hallway, and tried to get that feeling of dropping in my stomach to go away. Every time I moved, I felt like I was going to throw up all that water I just drank. It was then that I noticed that I had a ringing in my ears. But it wasn't actually sound. It was that feeling you get when there's too much quiet. It's really hard to explain. But it felt like it was crushing inside my head, right between my ears. And then it started to get worse. Suddenly, that emptiness I felt in the kitchen turned into a sense of impending doom and dread. It's the feeling you get when you feel like you're actually going to fall off a cliff. Or that split second before you get into a car crash. When your life flashes before your eyes. It felt like if I stood there for any longer, I would be pinned to the floor and crushed into oblivion. I didn't have time to think. I just reacted. It took every ounce of physical strength I had. Like pushing a car off of you in a once-in-a-lifetime feat of superhuman strength, just to take one step backwards towards my room. I spun around and bolted towards my door as a veil of darkness chased me down, wanting to imprison me. I swear, I felt the feeling of a million fingers touching the little hairs on the back of my neck as I reached out towards my doorknob. Any hesitation, and I'd have ceased to exist. My mind went blank as the last thought I thought I'd ever have pushed its way into the forefront of my awareness. It was just one word. Run. The next thing I knew, I was sitting next to my brother, in my room, just listening to him babble about something. And like a brick, all those familiar sounds from my family and the rest of the house hit my ears and snapped me completely back into reality. I looked around frantically and reached my hands up to my face and chest, and I could feel the water that was still there, the water I'd spilled, was still soaking into my shirt. My brother looked me over with a confused look on his face. He said something like, "Yo, what the hell happened to you? Why are you so sweaty?" I just played it off and told him it was some kind of weird panic attack. I didn't tell him what I had just experienced, since I really wasn't sure what happened. Now I know the first thing you're going to think, I was tripping on something, but that definitely was not what happened. I don't take any substances, and I don't drink. I know most people won't believe that statement, but it's the truth, even if it is coming from a 17-year-old high school student at the time. I was completely sober when this happened. I've been trying to figure it out ever since. I never told my brother or anyone else in the family, but I have been looking for answers. I've spoken to people online that said maybe it was some kind of a stroke or brain tumor. I'm pretty sure it wasn't anything like that, since I had gotten an MRI for a head injury that I had the month before after falling at a football game. My scan was completely clean. I didn't even have a concussion. I never hit my head before, but the school and my doctor just wanted to be sure everything was completely clean. So what the hell happened to me? Was it just my imagination? I doubt it, since it felt too real. Did I have some kind of a waking dream? Again, it felt too real. Remember the discussion I was having with my brother at the beginning of the story? About dissociative states? Well, I can assure you that what I experienced that day was something completely different. it was not a dream or my imagination. Maybe I slipped into some other terrifying dimension. I don't know. I've had nightmares about this experience ever since, and each time it ended the same way. With that veil of darkness finally getting a hold of me. I feel like if I ever find myself there again, whatever it is, I won't be coming back. I've lived in fear of going back there ever since, and I'm not sure